Hey there, everybody. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist, and welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first novel. And on my channel, I like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of writing, which is the characters. And the heart of the characters is in their psychology. So that's the angle I'll take with pretty much everything I talk about on my channel. Okay, so we are still doing my trope diagnosis series. Today I actually started drafting this yesterday, but I didn't get around to recording it yet. So this is technically the last video of February. So for February, I've been doing requested tropes. So today, this one is from Dal Cecil Runo, who wanted to talk about orphans. This is a really fun topic, actually, because if you think about it, in fantasy in particular, nobody lives to adulthood, apparently, if you have children. Like, as soon as you have children, like, something happens to you. The orphan is very, very popular in fantasy. And in some cases, I think fantasy handles it well. In some cases, and not so much. But anyway, this is a big topic. There's actually a lot of different avenues to it. So what I'll do is I'll touch on the basics of it. If you guys hear something in one of these that you really want me to go more in depth about, let me know, and I can do a video in the future going more in depth on some of this stuff. So that being said, so generally in fantasy, what we see with orphans is they're usually the main character, or they're part of the main character's crew. You know, they're coming along and they are going on the journey or the quest or whatever. So one of the main things with orphans is, depending on when they became an orphan, it's usually going to affect their ability to form relationships. So for instance, they did some research several years ago, basically looking at orphanages in Russia, Romania, places like that. And basically in those orphanages, they witnessed what we call failure to thrive, which is essentially a person is physically healthy. Like, physically they're fine. Emotionally and mentally, not so much. They're not really striving, they're not really motivated, they just kind of exist. And there's a reason for that. Most of the time in these types of orphanages, the children are tended to on a regular schedule, but they are not exposed to stimuli, they are not exposed to loving figures, so their basic needs are met, and that's about it. One of the most haunting things I've ever read is they were describing walking into the nursery of one of these orphanages, and they said it was so quiet because these babies had stopped crying because they had figured out their needs would not be met even if they did cry. So they stopped crying. And what they ended up doing, they actually did an experiment. I'm trying to remember who it was with. It was with a Romanian orphanage, I believe. And what they did is they took a group of children aged, I believe it was 3 months to, I believe, 8 years. And they split them into two groups. One group they kept in the orphanage and cared for them as per usual. The other group they sent to foster homes. And then they followed them up years later to see how they were doing. The children that were sent to foster homes did significantly better because now they had one person or one or two people that were responding to their needs and tending to them. And so they started to cry again. They started to attempt to bond. Now, I do use the word attempt because that is the main thing, I think, with orphans is we call it reactive attachment disorder. Basically what it is difficulty forming relationships and forming bonds with adults, with caregivers in general, and then generally with anybody in any type of relationship in general. Very difficult bonding. behavior. So this forms mainly when the child has not had a chance to form a bond with a parental figure. So if someone has become an orphan very, very young and they don't have a parental figure to bond to, then this is usually what you get. Or if the figure that they bonded to, if it was not a secure bonding, if it was a parent that became neglectful or emotionally abusive, that kind of thing. Uh, so what generally happens with this, and they actually have done, what was it? I want to say it was EEG. I think they've done brain scans on children that are diagnosed with RAD, which is what we call it, reactive attachment disorder, and children that are not. And they basically show them pictures of strangers and then pictures of their caregiver, their predominant caregiver. And what they found is with kids that are regularly adjusted, there is a reaction in the amygdala in their brain when they see mom or dad or whomever's taking care of them, which is essentially an activation of that bonding center where that bonding and attachment is. With kids that had RAD, there was no distinction between the caregiver and a stranger. So what does this mean? Does this mean that kids that have RAD are beyond help? No, it doesn't. There is help for them. We do therapy and family therapy and parental coaching for the parents and that kind of thing. And what we've found, children that were exposed to any kind of bonding, even if it was poor bonding, early on generally recover much easier because they have something to go off of. Kids that never had any bonding at all, it's much harder. But something that we have been discovering as of late is, let's say you have a kid that was never exposed to any parental figure, didn't bond with anybody, grew up in an orphanage or whatever. And then let's say they are adopted by a loving family who tries their best to, bond with them and build connections and whatnot. Kid doesn't respond well, but still has that connection. What we're finding is that if this occurs before a major developmental milestone, like say puberty or going into adulthood, what can happen is when you pass that milestone, your brain almost resets and says, okay, I have some evidence of bonding here. I'm going to build on it now. And so they can actually start to form those connections. It's almost like a computer reset almost when they pass into this new milestone, because the starts of that have been started in their neural pathways, and so the brain just kind of can build on it. Now, this obviously isn't true for everybody, but it's encouraging. And in terms of adoption, does adoption work? 80 to 98% of the time, yeah. Most of the time it does work. Kind of like with anything, there is no, this is going to work 100% of the time, because that just doesn't exist. You're never going to get 100%. But it is overall generally a good thing. Now, do adoptive children grieve their natural parents? Yes, in some sense. It varies by the person, and it varies by how old they were and that kind of thing. So if you're adopting a child that's much older, then they're probably going to go through a more formal grieving process about their biological parents, because they can remember them and that kind of thing. If the kid's very young, like if you adopt an infant, there is what we call essentially emotional memory, which is where the brain isn't developed enough to develop sequential memory, so like, moving pictures, that kind of thing. But they know that something else was there and they're not sure what it is. So they have to process that and work through that. And usually they kind of do it almost subconsciously, and as long as the parents are supportive and honest with them, about like questions about their origin and stuff, usually they aren't going to have a lot of problems. But again, this varies from person to person to person. So, what does this mean when we're talking about characters and stories? Well, like I said, sometimes stories get it right, sometimes they get it very, very wrong. So, I think the main thing to remember here is take into account how the person became an orphan and how old they were when it happened, because those are very, very important factors. Did they have any positive parental figure, or at least an attempt at a bonding relationship before they became an orphan? That's very important. What is their relationship now? Do they have new figures that are trying to be parental or guidance figures, that kind of thing? So, for instance, in my work in progress, I have a knee who is 7, and he is technically an orphan. His parents died before he was a year old, and he was raised by his uncle and his aunt until his uncle disowned him a few months before the story began. However, Ani had a positive relationship with his aunt up until uncle forced her hand, and a positive relationship bonding with his cousins. So he is in a pretty good position to form a new relationship with someone because he has had the starts of it and he had an effective bonding relationship prior. Then you have other characters who are not so lucky. I won't go into detail on who, but other characters are not that fortunate. And I think that's really the main thing to keep in mind when you're talking about orphans is each person is different. Each person has a different psychological makeup. And obviously, if they've been through other abuse besides just neglect and abandonment, then that is a whole other kettle of fish that adds more complexities onto the situation. I've not yet done a video on the different types of abuse. I can, if you guys want me to. They would be pretty heavy because, that's not a fun topic to talk about. But if that's something you guys want me to do, I can. Just let me know in the comments and I'll look into that. So I think those are the basic things when I'm talking about orphans. Another thing to consider, though, is there is essentially where you technically have parents, but they're not emotionally available. So it's kind of like you don't really have parents. When that happens, you generally seek out another relationship of some sort, whether it be an older brother, older sister, an aunt, an uncle, the teacher at school. Your brain looks for somebody to connect with. So if you have emotionally unavailable parents, a lot of times what you see is the siblings bond a lot closer than they normally would. Or they develop a strong relationship with their teacher at school or their counselor or things like that. So those are other things to keep in mind. But the same kind of thing still applies. So that is basically orphans in a nutshell. Like I said, this is a complex topic, and if you guys want me to go more in depth on any of this stuff, just let me know. I'll be glad to do that. If you like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss when I upload. I upload every Sunday, every Friday. If you guys have suggestions or comments, leave them below. I will get to them as soon as I can. Since we are now in March, I think I'm going to start a series of my least favorite tropes because those are fun. But like I said, aside from a few instances, I don't really think that tropes in and of themselves are necessarily bad. I think even the tropes I don't like can be written well. But I want to talk about just the psychology behind it because usually that's why I don't like these tropes because they're usually done really poorly. So that's what's going to be coming this month. So thank you guys for chiming in, and until next time, I hope you have a good one.